Ever since Michael J. Behe wrote his book, Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, he conceived his term in which what he called irreducible complexity, which is a system where the removal of one or more essential parts will make its main function go out of commission because such complexity cannot independently stand on its own unless the parts are joined together. In addition, such system cannot develop step by step in the process of evolution because all the evolutionary precursors must coexist interdependently and simultaneously. Irreducible complexity is considered to be a challenge for gradual evolution, although proponents and defenders of gradual evolution don't see it that way. Behe's irreducible complexity argument was interesting to others, but it was not free from criticism. Ken Miller, Richard Dawkins, and even YouTube user Quaila Su all argued that the irreducible complexity argument is a failed, unreliable argument and doesn't reflect how biological mechanisms work. They will argue that a so-called irreducible complex system doesn't necessarily have to be done directly. Rather, the system could have originated from possible scenarios of simple and indirect developmental pathways. Despite such condescending criticism, Behe ironically already acknowledged this issue as he has written in stone in his book on page 40 in 1996, quoted, "Even if a system is irreducibly complex and therefore cannot have been produced directly, however, one cannot definitely rule out the possibility of an indirect gratuitous route. But let's stop here for a minute and just look critically at some of the criticisms. One of Ken Miller's arguments against irreducible complexity is that individual precursors can connect to each other to form a more complex indirect functional system by natural selection, although it is a blind process as he admits in the video. Now, from the indirect system in which the functional individual parts arise are connected, we can have an irreducibly complex system which seems totally irrelevant to the interdependent indirect mechanism that evolved through the process of evolution previously. While such argument does seem feasible, which Behe does not completely deny, there are serious setbacks with this type of argument. One of the problems Miller forgets to mention is that proteins, which are basically the main sources of biological function, such as enzymes, hormones, and function, like for example insulin to control sugar levels, are not as simple as connect the dots or Legos. This is because a protein is not like a simple shape as he shows in his presentation that makes it seem as if they can easily connect to each other, like if you were playing Minecraft and you can connect one cube to the other. First off, a functional biological component is actually a very complex system. The functionality of a component arises from a certain third-dimensional complex folded structure and specified amino acid sequence that is once again called a protein. The geometric shape of a protein plays a crucial role in this function as that of the amino acid sequencing involved. Any wrong alteration on a third-dimensional protein structure or a change in the sequencing could cause it to be degraded or useless, resulting in the biological component to be either ineffective or useless. The folding of a protein structures is done automatically when the positively charged amino acid bonds with a negatively charged one. So amino acids also play a critical role in the folding structure of a protein. Only certain different types of amino acid sequences and their dimensional folding shapes are known to be functional as opposed to astronomical different possible sequencing and their dimensional structural combinations. Second, in order for a protein to play a role in a cell, it will have to connect to another type of protein that is attached on the outside membrane surface. The protein that sits outside the cell acts like some type of opening site receiver known as the receptor site. Third, this site is where enzymes, proteins like hemoglobin, and other biochemical molecules like antibiotic streptomycin go to work so they can maintain the balance or homeostasis of a living organism or disturb it, as observed in degraded or slowing down bacteria in antibiotics. Yet this protein that acts like a receptor is also too based on a certain amino acid sequence and precise their dimensional shape structure in order for it to act like one, and it requires at least 100 proteins for even a biological function to arise. So how exactly is this a problem for Miller's argument of natural selection connecting biological components? Well, recall that proteins are third-dimensional structures that could have folded into many other different types of geometry. Interestingly, the shape of a given functional protein is like a specialized key that is designed to only open specific locked doors. The locked doors in this case will be the receptor sites that are outside the cell. Each receptor site has its own unique shape and only favors its own certain different types of protein structures. If a functional protein was functional but did not correspond to the shape of the receptor site protein, the protein will not be able to do its work since the third dimensional structures between the two do not match. The receptor protein will have to rechange its third dimensional structure, but in real life that does not happen. Once the protein obtains its shape, it will stay that way permanently. Now that you have some grasp in how proteins act on the cell, you can now see where Miller's argument dies. Let's presuppose that somehow two or more functional different precursors somehow came by the process of evolution, and let's even say that they can connect together to form an even more complex system. Miller believes that because those individual biological components are functional, natural selection will undoubtedly use those components to its advantage and create a more complex system through indirect developmental pathways. Of course, for someone who is ignorant in how biological functions work, one can easily say this. However, when the critical details are examined, his argument seems to strongly fade away. The problem with this argument is that in order for a protein to connect with another protein to account into more complexity, it is important to realize that it is the highly complex third-dimensional shape and the amino acid sequencing that does the connecting, not the function itself. Recall earlier that a functional protein cannot interact with the cell by attaching to its receptor if it does not possess the right shape. So even if two or more functional components actually exist that can form an even more complex system that is halfway of an irreducible complex mechanism, there is no guarantee that the two will actually connect. As Michael Behe demonstrated in his book, biological components are extremely sophisticated. So sophisticated that they are made of only a limited amount of different third-dimensional structures compared to so many different types, as well as certain amino acid-based sequence out of over quadrillion possible different sequencing combinations. In addition, each biological protein component consists of its own favorable third-dimensional geometry and has a strong interest in bonding with only certain protein shapes that correspond to the third-dimensional shape of the protein. So if two biological components have the right function and create a more sophisticated system, as Miller says it is more likely that they will not bond together since both of them do not possess a tractable third-dimensional geometry. To put it more simple, think of those proteins as a jigsaw puzzle. What happens if you put two jigsaw pieces together but do not have the right shape? Obviously, they will not stick nor match since they both have different shapes, although they are part of the same puzzle. You cannot put a circle on a triangle. Well, that's the same thing with proteins. If you want to connect biological components together to form a more sophisticated system, you need to make sure they both have the right third-dimensional geometry. Otherwise, game over, natural selection, and go back to square one all over again. Another significant problem when it comes to evolution creating sophisticated systems is the fact that proteins do not last for long. They will all eventually become decayed and eventually die off soon. So if a protein has evolved into a functional molecular component by itself, it will have to bond with another component quickly and continue to independently replicate. Yet, unless a ribosome, which is a molecular machine in a cell that translates our mRNA for building a protein, was involved, proteins themselves do not replicate. They can only be manufactured. Of course, one might argue that beneficial mutations like point mutations can change certain nucleotide sequences and result into new proteins manufactured by the ribosome because of new mRNA expression. Contrary to this popular belief, the creation of new proteins is not what really happens in the cell when it comes to adaptive mechanisms such as antibiotic and insecticide resistance. If you look at my Evolution Fairy Tale number 15 video, I explain with peer-reviewed article citations of adaptation occurring with the cost of fitness, where this cost of fitness has degraded or terminated something in the cell due to the beneficial mutation, making the amino acid sequencing of a given protein enzyme less specific. Even among evolutionary articles that report new metabolic abilities of bacteria, they are reported to be caused by a mutation degrading the amino acid and shape specificity of pre-existing enzymes, while other cases are still trying to be understood. Because of the loss of specificity has occurred within those enzymes, they are more open to catalyze new molecular substrates as opposed to the important main one when they were more specific. One might argue, of course, that it is good for the enzyme to catalyze a more broader range of molecular substrates despite the loss of specificity. Actually, no, the cell does not tolerate enzymes that catalyze numerous molecular substrates. Rather, the cells need an enzyme to focus on its main important substrate more than the irrelevant ones that isn't at all that important for the cell. Now, another mechanism that can give bacteria the beneficial mechanism to metabolize new substrates is the activation of pre-existing cryptic pseudogenes by transposable genetic elements and recombination, as I have shown in my junk DNA executed and pseudogenes video. Now, contrary to what the majority might think, adaptation or new beneficial phenotypes can happen even without beneficial mutations, nor even a single change in the nucleotide DNA sequence. It's called epigenetics. Epigenetics in, let's say, Darwin's finches can result into a variety of different phenotypic finches, not by beneficial mutation changing certain nucleotide sequences, but by changing its biochemistry, typically the usage of hormones. So adaptation or new phenotypes isn't necessarily correlated by a change in the DNA nucleotide sequence, but by altering the organism's biochemistry. So some Miller arguments of the only way this could have happened by evolution is if all those proteins existed simultaneously and connected together into a more sophisticated system, all at almost the same time frame before they decayed away and ceased to exist. But what are the chances of that happening all at the same time, given just how extremely sophisticated the proteins are because of the need of right sequencing out of many possible different ones, the right precise dimensional geometric structure? I will say pretty much virtually never. Does this mean it's impossible to happen? Nope, but it virtually is. So Miller's argument isn't really at all that satisfying when it comes to arguing against Behe's irreducible complexity challenge. This is rather a misrepresentation. Excuse me, can't pronounce it right. And a strawman of Behe's argument. Michael Behe never said that the removal of something in the complex system will mean that the individual parts have no function, nor that the overall mechanism will be rendered useless. Nope, that wasn't Behe's point at all, Mr. Miller. Behe said that the removal of the essential parts that actually contribute to the main function of an irreducible complex system of a given functional system, will render it useless. And he never said that the individual parts will be useless in the sense that they can't have secondary functions. Now let's look at other irreducibly complex critics such as Quayle-Seup. Quayle-Seup believes that addition, subtraction, or change of parts can eventually develop a so-called irreducible complex system indirectly, as in his Venus flytrap example. However, as I have gone over Miller's argument, the process in which two or more proteins connect is an extremely difficult task. I'm not going to repeat myself why that is the case. So in order for a Quayle-Seup argument to be valid, it must be presupposed already that the proteins had the right dimensional shapes for them to connect, and that they found a way to somehow continue persisting, since proteins do not last forever. Now, to be fair, I'm going to give Quayle-Seup mercy by having myself pretend that indeed the biological components were connected together to form a more complex system. So instead of basing my criticism that, well, you haven't shown me any evidence that each step by step that such system can evolve, so therefore your argument is invalid, I'm going to accept that the connection of biological parts has indeed been achieved. Now here's a challenge for Quayle-Seup and other critics like him. But first, let's go over a funny classical cartoon analogy, Tom and Jerry. Suppose there was a scene, and two later, where Jerry the mouse will be walking along, notice cheese or some other bait on the floor, and eventually pick it up. The cheese, unaware by Jerry, was tied by a string to a stick that was propped against a ball. When Jerry's cheese was moved, the attached string pulled down the stick, and the ball will start to roll away as Jerry stands at the target area. The ball then will fall off a cliff into the raised end of a seesaw, smacking it down and sending a rock with an attached piece of sandpaper hurtling into the air. On its upward journey, the sandpaper will strike a match sticking out on the cliff, and sending a rock with attached, which led the fuse to a cannon. The cannon will fire on its downward track. The cannonball will hit the rim of a funnel, the only allowance for error in the whole scenario, roll around the edge a few times, and fall through. As it came out of the funnel, the cannonball would hit against a lever that started a circular saw. The saw would cut through a rope which was holding up a telephone pole. Slowly, the telephone pole will begin to fall, and too late, Jerry will realize that the fascinating show was at his expense. As Jerry looks at the onset of action, Tom shows up right next to him with excitement, waiting for the telephone pole to smash Jerry. But instead, and ironically, The telephone pole landed on Tom's head and slammed him hard to the ground. What happened here? When you think about it for a moment, you realize that Tom's crazy invention sounds like irreducibly complex. It is a single system composed of several interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, which is smashing Jerry with a telephone pole, and where the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to cease functioning. Now, unlike biological complexity like the bacterial flagellum, the cartoon system is not a single piece where the components simultaneously exert force against each other. Rather, it is composed of separate pieces, each acting in turn, one after the other, to accomplish its function. Because the components of the cartoon system are separated from each other in time and space, just one of them, the telephone pole, accomplishes the ultimate purpose of the system, bopping Jerry on the head. Nonetheless, the complexity of the system is not thereby reduced because all system components are required to deliver the blow at the correct time and at the correct place. If the mechanism to trigger its fall were in place, Tom could walk back and forth in front of the telephone pole all day with excitement, and no harm would come to him, unlike Jerry's unfortunate event. Now let's compare this to the complexity of blood clotting. In our blood clotting system, about 2 to 3% of the protein in blood plasma, the part that's left after the red blood cells are removed, consists of a protein complex called fibrinogen. The name fibrinogen, excuse me if I can pronounce it right, is easy to remember because the protein makes fibers that form the clot. Yet fibrinogen is only the potential clot material. Like the cartoon telephone pole, fibrinogen is like a weapon or emergency kit waiting to be unleashed. Almost all of the other proteins involved in blood clotting control the timing and placement of the clot. This too is similar to our cartoon example. All components except the telephone pole were required to control the pole's fall. Fibrinogen is a composite of 6 protein chains containing twin pairs of 3 different proteins. Electronic microscopes have shown that fibrinogen is a rod-shaped molecule with 2 round bumps on each end of the rod and a single round bump in the middle. So fibrinogen resembles a set of barbells with an extra set of weights in the middle of the bar. Normally, fibrinogen is dissolved in plasma like salt is dissolved in ocean water. It floats around peacefully minding its own business until a cut or injury causes bleeding. Then another protein called thrombin slices off several small pieces from 2 of the 3 pairs of protein chains in fibrinogen. The trim protein, now called fibrin 2, has sticky patches exposed on the surface that have been covered by the pieces that were cut off. Because of the shape of the fibrin molecule, long thread forms cross over each other, and much as fisherman's net traps fish, makes a pretty protein meshwork that entraps blood cells. This is the initial clot. The meshwork covers a large area with a minimum of protein. If it simply formed a lump, much more protein will be required to clog up an area. Thrombin, which cuts off the piece from fibrinogen, is like the circular saw from the Tom and Jerry cartoon. Like the saw, thrombin sets in motion the final step of a control process. But what if the circular saw ran continuously, without needing the other steps to turn it on? In that case, the saw would immediately cut the rope holding up the telephone pole. Similarly, if the only proteins involved in blood coagulation were thrombin and fibrinogen, the process will be uncontrolled and eventually the blood clotting will not be achieved. Uncontrolled thrombin will quickly clip all of the fibrinogen to make fibrin and eventually build up a massive clot which will form throughout the organism's circulatory system, blocking blood flow and eventually leading to a possible heart attack. Unlike cartoon characters, real animals will rapidly perish if the proteins involved in the blood clotting system did not time and position itself properly. Any little tweak in those proteins could lead to an unhappy ending for the organism, even though they are simultaneously connected as a complex system. For example, fibrinogen could put fibrin in the wrong position and fail to clot the opening bleeding site, which would eventually cause the organism to bleed to death. In order for the blood clotting system to work, not only must the proteins work as a team, but they must also hit the right positioning, timing, and control in order to achieve its main purpose. Any small tweak and boom, the system crashes and the organism probably dies due to a blood loss or a massive heart attack. So when it comes to irreducibly complex systems, it isn't just the connecting of two or more biological components that matter, but also the importance of precise timing, positioning, and regulatory control of the system itself. Just like Tom's so-called irreducible complex system, his system failed because even though all the components were connected simultaneously, the angle and positioning of the telephone pole was incorrect, which eventually hit Tom rather than Jerry. Even using quality soup examples of the Venus flytrap, many things could go wrong with it. For example, the Venus mouth could be too small to capture the fly. That's one possibility. Its mouth could be too massive that eventually the fly will be tiny enough to leave one of the opening areas in the mouth. That's another possibility. The thickness could fill halfway the fly mouth and have difficulty closing its mouth. And even the thickness can be too small for the fly to be glued, which is another possibility. There are so many possible scenarios that can go wrong when it comes to a so-called irreducible complex system. So not only do evolutionists like quality soup have to say, well, as long as the components connect indirectly and develop indirectly, it's all good. They also had to presuppose that the timing, positioning, and even the controls involved in the system were done properly to ensure the proper function of the overall system. Otherwise, the system crashes and game over evolution. Go back to square one. Does this mean that a system that can develop indirectly is impossible? Nope, but it virtually is. So the indirect route argument that argues against irreducible complexity isn't really at all that quite convincing given the variety of serious dilemmas that had to be overcome first. Which is one of the reasons why Michael Behe does not believe that indirect route actually accounts for the irreducible complexity of the living organisms. Well, that's the end of my argument in defense of irreducible complexity. Thanks for watching.